So I'll repeat the rules one last time. First speaker
Yeah.
gets all the speakers gets 3 minutes. The first speaker for each side gets 2 minutes at the start, 1 minute at the end, to make it fair. And yeah, I guess we'll start now. Yash is the first speaker for the proposition. The topic is, can censorship be justified? Yash, the floor is yours.
Okay, just confirming the marking is content, logic, and rebuttal or something like that, right?
Yes, it is content, logic, and the question answer session. So here's your timer is ready, and start.
Okay, the motion today reads censorship can be justified, and I'm proposing the motion. I'm the speaker opening the argument for the proposition, and I would like to start by stating that censorship today refers mostly to internet censorship, and given that most devices with access to the internet have access to basically everything on the internet, censorship has to be implemented because there are certain members of society that should not be given access to information that is available to all other members of society. For example, children. Parental controls are a major part of censorship. And when we think of censorship, we must not only think of things like news media, but also things like Netflix, for example. You have to have certain degrees of censorship in order to limit, let's say, gory content, violent content, overly sexual content from children, because that is just how society has been built and how it should function. And thus, a certain degree of censorship is required to limit such content from children. For example, a PG-13 rating or a UA rating or an A rating in countries like India is a very apt example of censorship and is very necessary for society to function normally. And removing such measures will essentially cause a breakdown of society and rules as we know it. Furthermore, censorship is also necessary because people should not be given access to all information that is available on the web or on the internet. For example, government and military websites. And if information is leaked from here, there are laws in place. For example, the Espionage Act in America, which was introduced in the late 1900s, and certain other measures in Indian government too, which are in place in order to prevent such things. There is information that should not be made public, and would, if made public, would raise certain serious military and security concerns, and for that reason, that information has to be censored. For example, WikiLeaks, the creation of WikiLeaks itself was a crime, and therefore the creator of WikiLeaks was a wanted man in America, and therefore things like this call for adequate censorship for society to function and for state security, and therefore censorship cannot be removed as a whole. And in many cases, more often than not in democratic society, censorship is justified.
Okay, that's it. Yeah.
And will remain justified.
Okay, thank you, Yash. That's your 2 minutes. You'll get another minute at the end. At the end of the next few, after the next few speakers are done. We'll begin with questions on this part first. So I guess Arth is the first one with a question. Arth, you may ask your question.
So don't you think the whole idea of censorship teaches us to ignore the idea of real features or ignoring what is real? End of the day, we should understand that whatever we are censoring is something which exists in the society, right? It just means that we are hiding what is true. And don't you think hiding what is true is wrong?
I think there are certain truths that should be available to certain members of society and not to other members, and therefore hiding those truths from those members of society is adequate censorship and not overly adequate censorship. The motion does not read censorship can always be justified. It is that censorship can be justified.
Right.
Okay. Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, right. Is there any rebuttal, Arth? Is there any follow-up you would like to ask, or?
Yeah, no, definitely. So, sir, since where you talked about the part where you said that censorship can be justified, it is like where you talk about where censorship can be justified, basically using the keyword being always here. So when we talk about the whole idea of censorship and you saying that it is something which should be available to a general section of the society, how do you firstly, apart from the part where we talk about children being not allowed to see certain things which are available on the internet,
one question.
The other members of the society, how do you draw the line that this guy or this person is someone or is something which should not get to see what you want to show them? How do you distinguish or discriminate between the existence?
Yeah. First of all, there are already laws in place to do this. For example, things like military or security information are only available to people with government clearance for the same, and therefore, if you don't have it, then things like WikiLeaks are breaching that and therefore have to be censored by the government. Furthermore, talking about who gets to see what, producers of content under the law have the right to choose who they want to show their content to, and therefore censorship on those grounds.
Thank you,
Right.
sir.
All right. Thank you, Yash. Is there any other questions? All right. Aryan, you may ask a question.
Right. So, given the fact that you mentioned the Espionage Act, and you said that government issued military secrets should not be put on the internet in the first place. Given the fact that things that have security clearances above a civilian level would never be uploaded on the internet in the first place, and
Exactly. How do
censorship
you
is often
censor it?
undertaken. They're undertaken by third parties. Right? Censorship is arbitrary action undertaken by third parties. So the fact that a government would never upload it in the first place means that everything that is intentionally uploaded on the internet is meant for media for public consumption. Since it is meant for public consumption, a third party interfering arbitrarily inside that information would not be a violation of free speech.
Okay, so first of all, so your question is fundamentally wrong because it assumes that all military or security secrets on the internet are uploaded by the government. The whole concept of the government censoring such things is based on when these things are leaked. For example, WikiLeaks or Edward Snowden. When these things are especially leaked and the government does not intend for them to be available to the public, is when they have to be censored when they are uploaded.
Okay.
My question stands answered.
Before we move on, thank you, Yash. Thank you, Aryan. Before we move on to the next speaker, I'd like to mention to the speakers that to keep your questions a bit shorter, and when one person is speaking, not to interrupt them. That's with that being said, we'll be moving on to our first opposition speaker, which is Arth Agarwal. Arth, for the
I was going
next.
first.
Oh,
It's
apologies.
Aryan. It's
Oh,
yeah.
oh, I'm sorry. Aryan, for the next 2 minutes, you have the floor.
Okay, so my name is Aryan Singhania, and I stand strongly against the motion that censorship can be justified. I believe that it cannot, and because of certain reasons that I will elaborate upon. Now, first, we need to understand the fact that the idea of censorship, stems from ancient Greek, where Plato, in his book, The Republic, essentially advocated the idea of censorship, and coincidentally, in that book, he also happened to oppose the idea of democracy. Now, I do not believe those things aren't correlated, and I think that and that serves my point, saying that censorship falls against the very idea of a democracy. Second of all, there was a certain case that took place in India a few years ago. It was called the Abbas versus the Union of India, and the main argument, Abbas was a film director, and the main argument that he said against the BCCI for sorry, not the BCCI, the censorship board of India, was the fact that censorship is arbitrary in its very nature, which means that the person, because the issue of moral subjectivity, which is the legal definition of obscenity, includes the words depraving and corrupting. But those two words are not defined in law, and those two words are open to interpretation. Now, what is defined as depraving and corrupting is left to the ever changing standards of morality, and the words depraving and corruptive are often up to interpretation. That interpretation leaves an window open for arbitration, and that arbitrariness of this subject matter leads to the very violation of free speech that it is. Another fact is, barring selective cases like military censorship or corporate espionage, barring those things which are used for libel and slander, barring anything that's illegal, censorship is used for political agenda, censorship is used for religious agenda, and censorship is, given that it's used for religious agenda, opens its doors for intolerance. Therefore, that is another point, serving to my point, that censorship falls against the very idea of a democracy and free speech. And therefore, I believe that censorship from its very roots is unjustified and should not have a place in our society. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Aryan. We will now be taking questions on this speech. The first question, Ave.
So you said that censorship as a concept doesn't allow democracy, but taking into account the fact that the law allows the government to censor things such as libel, as well as it allows the judiciary to enforce contempt of court, don't you think that those actually uphold democracy rather than go against it?
Right. So, regardless of you misquoting what I said, I will simply define the two words that you just said. Libel under law is defined as a misstatement of fact with the intent to harm the goodwill of the party in grief, and contempt of court is a deliberate miscarriage of the orders of a court. Both of those things not completely in relation to the topic at hand, and therefore I do not believe I understand your question.
Um, all right.
Could I question
Uh,
that?
Yeah.
sure.
So contempt of court is also applicable if someone is verbally going against, not exactly going against, but lowering the dignity of the court. That also comes under contempt of court, and you can be punished for lowering the dignity of court through things that you say. Isn't that censorship? And how is
So
that
that
against
is
democracy?
so that is not censorship. That is a violation of civil and criminal procedure, which is laid out in the CPC and CRPC, which states that you should not be violating court procedure. That is less of freedom of speech violation and more of a criminal and civil procedure violation, which would be defined as a crime in the Indian Penal Code.
Right. There will be no further cross question to this. Thank you, Agar. Yash, your question.
Okay, so first of all, your entire speech focused on the idea of barring where the government enforces censorship in order to enforce the law, right? For example, military censorship, corporate espionage, things like that. However, you must realize that whenever the government practices censorship, their justification is always upholding the law because the government exists as an enforcer of the law.
Could you repeat that? Could you repeat that? I couldn't hear you. Sorry.
And so often, several times in your speech, you have stated that you're talking about censorship barring things like corporate espionage or military secrets, things like that. However, what you must realize is whenever a government practices censorship, right, it is automatically claiming to uphold the law in its own sense because the government exists as a body to uphold the legal system as it has been defined. And therefore, whenever a government practices censorship, it is essentially upholding the legal system and the law. Furthermore, you spoke about Plato's book, The Republic. However, that refuted
Yash,
something.
keep it short, please.
Sir, I think there's a
Different
network
questions.
issue. I couldn't hear him after government. Could you repeat the last two
Yash,
statements?
can you repeat your question
I
in
can't hear
short,
him.
concise way?
I have 3 questions to 3 points he made, 3 very valid points that he made in the speech. So I have to make 3 questions to them. Okay. Firstly, you continuously stated in your speech that you're like talking about censorship barring military secrets, corporate espionage, things like that. However, whenever a government practices censorship, it is claiming to uphold the legal system because that is the function of the government. And therefore, whenever a government practices censorship, it is always on grounds that are violating the law. Therefore, how can you justify your statement? Secondly, sir, you stated.
Let him answer the first question, then we'll move on to the next one.
Okay, sir.
So this entire debate revolves around the justification of the law of censorship. We are not debating that the government is enforcing it wrongly. We are saying that the law existing in itself is wrong, and the fact that the law should not exist in the way that it does.
Just to before there is any follow-up, I'd like to clarify that we are not discussing censorship as a law in itself, but or censorship laws, but we are discussing censorship as a concept. Of course, censorship laws do come under it, but we are discussing the concept of censorship under which you can discuss it. Okay, Yash,
So,
one last question. Yeah.
no, can I reply to that?
Oh yeah,
that
rebuttal.
question.
Yes, go on.
So first of all, so since this is being recorded, can record can be checked later? The speaker oftentimes conceded to the fact that censorship under military grounds of corporate espionage is correct, and therefore, since the motion reads censorship can be justified, and since he's proposing the motion, his uh, line of line of debate is fundamentally wrong in itself, and in fact, concedes to certain parts of the motion. His stance should not technically occur.
Okay.
Right. So the answer to your original question was the last line of my answer to your original question included the wording that censorship law should not exist in the way it does. I never said it should not exist. I said it should be amended in order to uphold free speech better.
Yes, sir. And exactly my point was exactly that. Censorship can be justified, and was always proposed the motion. Right?
Right, that's understood. We will, and to your question
Moderators or
about,
moderators or
one second,
something to add your.
one second. Let me finish. We will check the recording afterwards and confirm everything, and then come to a decision. And yes, Arth, you had a question.
Yeah, firstly, with regard to the question raised by, or the query, or the whatever raised by Yash, whenever a motion in the House is something which is not favoring one party, or something which is, what to say, something which is favoring a part of the House, what is done is basically the opposition or the proposition, whoever the motion is not favored to, should understand the meaning of the motion, because a debate is never that concrete in nature, because these terms are not given, and we should understand what we are trying to imply or what we are trying to discuss here, right? So always going with the lines of the motion, or going with the words of the motion and calling it the line of the debate, is not essentially what we do in debates, right, moderator sir? So
But
something,
what's your point?
your explanation on this part, because the motion clearly mentions the
Yeah.
whole concept of censorship, but there are
Right.
certain points or certain parts where the opposition cannot, what to say, cannot exclude or cannot ignore the real objects which exist in the society. Therefore the line of the debate has to be maintained according to that, right? So
Okay, so
I will. Yeah, I understand.
yeah, exactly.
I will consider that. Yes, but firstly, you must understand that what we are doing right now cannot be classified as a conventional debate. That is first. Secondly, this is not only for the purpose of competition, but also for the purpose of discussion. I realize that there are certain points that are hard to make, seeing as you are of the opposition. But then there's certain exceptions that we have to make, right? Yeah, sure, had something to say.
yeah, I had a second question that you allowed me to ask.
Yes, that is your last question. Go on.
Okay, so the speaker spoke about Plato's book, The Republic, wherein, while in one part of the book he proposed the concept of censorship, in another part of the book he opposed what he
So due
said
to
was.
network errors, I will have to ask you to speak slower.
Yeah.
So speaker stated that in Plato's book, The Republic, in one part of the book he proposed censorship, and in the other part he opposed democracy, right? However, what we need to understand is that when the book was written, which is in Plato's time, the concept of democracy that was talked about is called Greek democracy, which focuses on full autonomy. And a limiting of that democracy into what we call modern day democracy came with the concept of censorship. And therefore, what Plato was opposing was not democracy as we know it right now, but democracy as they knew it back then, right? Thank you.
Yeah, Aryan, do you have a response?
I don't see a question mark there to answer.
Uh, well, Yash, are you willing to amend your question in
Question
a?
mark.
I
And a
mean,
question mark.
Yash, would you be open? Would you be willing to change the wording of your question in a way that is more?
I got his question. Sir, I am unfamiliar with the exact notions of Greek democracy, so I will have to get back to you after history course in Bachelor of Sciences. Thank you.
uh,
I have a
all right,
question.
so we'll leave that as a question that will be answered later, I would assume. Pranit,
I
you
have
have
a
a question.
question.
Yes, that is the last question, and we will move on to the next speaker right after that. Pranit,
Aryan, you
there's a
mentioned
question.
that in a court ruling, it was argued that since the contents of what is morally subjective, such as something which is considered depraving or corrupting, is not exactly defined. However, considering that certain types of content, such as child pornography or extreme violence, is psychologically damaging to certain groups of people, for example, small children, and considering that there's no way to actually protect these groups from that content besides censorship at this point, what do you propose? Should we end censorship once and for all just for that?
So with the question of child pornography, you are going into several violations of the law, right? Child pornography would constitute as a violation of contract law. It would constitute as rape in itself. Therefore, it is not only a violation of censorship law. That is my point, right? And again, nowhere in my entire speech did I say you should eradicate censorship. I said censorship in its current form is not justified in most places. For example, the censorship of, say, 50 Shades of Grey. That is the most unjustified censorship I have personally seen ever.
Right. I think we've Pranit, you've understood what he has to say, and We'll move on to the next speaker now, who I think is Pranit itself. For
Yeah.
No, it's me.
it's Ave, right? So Ave, for the next 3 minutes, let me get my timer ready. Yeah, Ave, for the next 3 minutes, the floor is yours.
Okay, just for
All right.
audibility purposes, whoever is not speaking,
Just tell me when I can start.
Yash, yes.
whoever is not speaking, can you please mute yourself? It's kind of hard to hear.
All right, all right.
Yeah.
Ave, you have the floor now.
So Aryan, in his exchange with Yash, he said, and I quote, "Censorship laws should be amended to protect free speech better." Sir, if you have censorship laws in any way, shape, or form, you cannot have the complete concept of absolutely free speech. But my point is that the functioning of a true democracy is not impeded in any way by a lack of absolute free speech. Free speech is necessary up to a point or up to an extent, but after a point it gets excessive. It gets excessive after a point where you can't consider it okay in a civilized society anymore. For example, racism, sexism, xenophobia, which is spread online by several people, we cannot allow things like that to be in the uh, on the internet, or rather as a point of discussion on the internet, and that is something that should, in my opinion, be censored. And you, in your speech, were saying that censorship and democracy together cannot exist, but the point is that in our democracies, censorship already exists in numerous ways. For example, libel laws, contempt of court. If somebody is saying something which is lowering the dignity of the court, you can check this if you wish. And absolute free speech in this way is not necessary to protect democracy. Furthermore, such censorship is not solely on the part of the government. A lot of private companies also practice censorship. For example, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, all of these social media companies have a variety of terms of use and terms of service which they enforce and remove a large amount of content which they don't believe is suitable or which should be spread on their platform. For example, child pornography, for example, sexual content, racist, hate speech, racism, sexism, xenophobia, a variety of things like this. And you can't say that censorship in this way would be negating the concept of democracy. Some form or some amount of censorship is necessary in order for the functioning of a proper civilized society. Obviously, I'm not saying that we can give the government the power to censor anything and everything they want, because obviously that would be open to abuse and open to a lot of a lot of arbitrariness. However, there is a point up to which censorship can be justified. Censorship again is not always justified, but in some cases censorship is necessary in order to maintain our society. Mm. Yeah, I'm done.
Is that it? Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we'll be taking questions now. Aryan, do you have a question?
Could he repeat the first part of his speech, please?
Which
I
could you repeat?
started
Yeah.
by quoting something you said, or if a word may be off here or there, but essentially what you said is censorship laws should be amended to protect free speech better. You said this during your exchange with Yash Aryan. You can check the recording if you want. And my point was that censorship laws cannot. The presence of censorship laws does not ensure that absolute free speech will be there. The essential concept of censorship is some restriction of free speech. However, such a small amount of restriction on free speech is not going to
Right, sir, I
impede the
understand.
functioning of a
No, yeah. I have a question.
so,
Go on, Aryan.
Right. So given that in the exchange that you quoted, the same exchange involves the statement that censorship should not be eradicated; it should be amended to suit democracy better. My question to you would be that, given the fact that the current provisions for free speech already has eight separate exceptions to it, do you not believe that certain unnecessary censorship. For example, the censoring of the word "forgive me," it should be stricken off record, but the word "asshole" should not be censored in a UA-rated movie or an R-rated movie, given that it is already R-rated. Movies like 50 Shades of Grey, they had words which are very well known to adults censored unnecessarily. My point being that hate speech, you should not allow the KKK to roam on the streets, because that would obviously be consisting of hate speech. But the fact that there is a lot of unnecessary censorship in the world,
Aryan,
do you
keep
not
it
believe
short,
that the
please.
law is do you
Could
not
I?
believe that
Yeah, I've
censorship
got
law
your
is meant?
question.
Okay.
Sir, I'm not saying that censorship is in the current censorship laws are absolutely perfect. I'm not even that's not even within the purview of this debate. You yourself said that members of the KKK shouldn't be allowed to roam the streets and say whatever they want because that would be hate speech. So that is censorship. You're giving up your argument and you're giving up your side right over there. You're saying that censorship, there is excessive censorship, and you're bringing up a variety of things which you believe is excessive censorship. But sir, you keep positing that some amount of censorship is okay. And sir, when you say that even a little bit of censorship is okay, that's where you lose the debate. Because the topic is censorship can be justified. As soon as you say that censorship in any form can be justified, you lose the debate.
Right. Are there any other questions before we proceed? Seeing as there are none, I think at this point of the debate, I'd like to put forward a very commonly asked question that's all over the internet. Is that does censorship violate the freedom of speech? So what I'm trying to say is, let's say I'll give you the example of media. Let's say there's certain knowledge about the government that the government does not want released to the public, but members of the media have become aware of it, and the government is censoring the media to the extent at which they say that no, you cannot publish this news, otherwise there will be reprimandations. So in simple, the question I'm trying to put forward to the house is that, do you think that it is a violation of the freedom of speech and expression when the government is asking these media outlets not to put this forward? Okay, seeing as Yash raised his hand first,
Could
Yash,
I could I just clarify something?
yeah, sure, go ahead.
When I said that it's a that it in some way is against the freedom of speech, what I meant is it's against absolute freedom of speech and
Right,
expression.
right, right.
And I'm not, which is obviously not guaranteed by any
Yeah,
constitution or any law.
yeah. Yash, you had a question, or we'll move to Aryan for now.
So could
Aryan,
Aware repeat what he said? I couldn't hear him.
I'm
he
talking
said that uh, the freedom of speech, no, in no way is censorship. Or no, Aved, why don't you just repeat it for Aryan?
My what I'm trying to say is I'm just clarifying what I'm saying is that I'm trying to say that censorship is not a violation of the freedom of speech as it exists in law or in constitutions around the world. Censorship is against the concept of absolute freedom of speech and expression, where people can say and
Right, right,
do
right.
say
We
and
got it.
express anything
Right.
they want, however they want, which
Understood.
is obviously not guaranteed by any law.
Right. Yash, you had something to say.
Okay, can I respond to the question you posted?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so first of all, when we talk about any concept like freedom of speech, we must consider the concept on different levels, right? There is certain, for example, even the concept of democracy. We don't consider full autonomy when we say democracy, or when we consider Article 1, Subclause 2 of the UN Charter, for example, right to self-determination. We don't consider R2SD as a whole, right? We don't consider full autonomy, even though it's
Right.
part of the UN Charter, and all countries have signed off on the R2SD. They do not practice full autonomy, because if that were true, then Kashmir would not be a part of India. And essentially, when we talk about things like the freedom of speech, we must consider freedom of speech on a practical level and on a pragmatic level at which the government can enforce it and the people can practice it, right? So when we talk about free speech and freedom of expression like this, free speech comes with certain defined exceptions. For example, hate speech or the
Right.
Espionage Act in America. Law defines what freedom of speech or free speech is, and in different countries, the definition varies. However, one thing remains the same: freedom of speech, free speech, or democracy are concepts that must in a practical nature come with certain exceptions, and this is what the law enforces in the form of censorship. For example, when the government wants to censor leaks of government military secrets that they will think leads to a violation of domestic peace and security or international peace and security, then they must do so via censorship. And if,
Right.
for example, hate speech is being practiced, or certain privately owned social media platform or the government itself can pass laws or practice active censorship in order to enforce the law, which is again not a violation of the freedom of speech, but an exception that comes with it legally. That's
Right.
all.
All right, that's it.
Suryansh, could
Parikshit,
you?
All
sorry
right.
to interrupt. Parikshit just texted on the group.
That is not
Yeah,
that doesn't matter right now.
No,
But
Suryansh,
can he
for
join? Can he join? Can he join?
Yeah,
uh,
because the option has one speaker less, so if he could join, that's kind of
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
I can ask him. Wait.
he can
Wait.
join through the link. I'm pausing it. Yeah, Aryan, you had something to say about the question posted to the house.
yes, I did. Okay. So how freedom of speech works and how freedom of speech is enforced is there is Article 19 in the Indian Constitution. Article 19 has 8 or 9 subclauses. All 8 of 9 of those subclauses are defined in the Code of Criminal Procedure and the Indian Penal Code. If you violate that, you will be sent to jail or you will be given a fine. That is simple. So if you indulge in hate speech, this is the fine. If you indulge in slander or libel, this is the fine. That is defined entirely. Outside that, there is a principle in law that states that anything is permitted that isn't expressly restricted by the law. So if the law doesn't say it, it means I can do it regardless of whoever thinks whatever, regardless of the morality of the situation. If I am saying something or publishing something that isn't expressly restricted in the law, why does anyone have the right to restrict that based on their arbitrary opinion, based on the questions of moral subjectivity, like because depraving and corrupting the words like that aren't
Yeah,
defined in the law? So that gives rise to the question that why should anyone have arbitrary right to restrict what I am telling the public or what I am publishing on the internet without express provisions in the law?
right. Yash,
so.
you have something?
Can I
Yeah.
respond to that?
Uh,
Okay, so first of all, when you publish something on the internet, you're not directly publishing it on the internet, right? You're using a middleman. For example, a social media platform or a platform where you publish it. For example, Instagram or let's say Facebook or um, even Quora or WikiHow. Things like that are platforms signing into which or making an account on which you have to agree to something called their terms of condition, their terms and conditions, right? So even though what you're posting might not directly be a violation of the law as it's written, it might be a violation of terms and conditions stated when you're making an account on the application. And several platforms, for example, the Facebook had the all the platforms that Facebook holds the rights for example, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and Snapchat. All the terms and conditions for these specific social media platforms expressly state that the social media platform reserves the right to remove any content from their platform
yeah, yeah,
if
yeah.
they deem that it is a violation of what they stand for and the morals or that they try to uphold. And
Right,
therefore, even though it does not violate the law, by agreeing to those terms and conditions and making your account, you have automatically conceded to their terms, and
I
therefore you must
never
abide by them.
But in my comment on the question posed to the house, I never once said that censorship is illegal. I always said that it is legal. It is just a question of morality. Why should he have the right to do something which he isn't expressly restricted in the law to do?
yeah,
That was my
because
question. And
and
Yash
like
is only. I understand what Yash is saying. I do not understand how it is relevant to what I said because I never said that it's illegal. It is not
You said,
restricted in
quote
the.
unquote, just now everyone heard you, that why should someone be allowed to restrict me from doing that isn't expressly against the law or expressly doesn't go against anything that's stated in the law, right?
Why social media, I'm sorry to cross talk, but why social media sites restrict certain content is to subsidy their own liability, right? If someone posts a KKK photo on Instagram itself is not going to be liable for that photo, but the person will be. However, people are going to condemn Instagram for keeping that photo on. It is not a question of censorship at that point. It's a question of personal liability, which is why they will take it off.
Okay, sir, your argument is
Sir,
based on
yeah,
sir,
Yash, one second.
intention.
Yash, one second. Ave, you had something to add?
Yeah, so when you say it's a question, or it's not a question of censorship, it's a question of personal liability, sir, I think we would all agree that it's a question of both censorship and personal liability. Where you keep saying that this censorship, as you said, of child pornography is prevented under a variety of different laws, and hence censorship of it is not necessary. But sir, I believe, and I'm sure many of the others would agree that it's a question of both censorship as well as the various other laws which you spoke about. Furthermore, you said that people should not be allowed to be censored, or their speech should not be restricted in any way which is not expressly
Right.
prohibited. So, could you please clarify whether or not you think that if something is saying something or expressing something is expressly prohibited, do you think
Right.
that would
Right.
be okay for that to be
Yeah.
censored or not? Because if
All
you
right.
do, then that's again, you'll be violating your
Okay.
stance. You'll be
Yeah.
No, sir.
Thank you, Ave.
See, the
Yeah.
thing is,
Can't hear anything.
it's
Can't hear anything. Hello.
Right. What, Ave, would you like to repeat, like, just the last part, the question that you want clarified for Earth?
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify whether Aryan thought that if the law or if the social media sites' terms of conditions and terms of use specified certain things which they weren't allowed, which users weren't allowed
okay.
to say or
I'll
weren't allowed
clarify
to
that part.
post,
Yeah.
whether he would believe that that should be removed.
Cool.
So in the first my first speech, I said that uh, censorship acts as an impediment to free speech. Exact statement. When there is an exception to free speech, which is, for example, hate speech, that speech is not legal anymore, hence does not fall under the purview of free speech. Therefore, your censorship is not going to be an impediment to that, because it isn't free speech anymore. It is simply an illegal act. You say that black people should die. That is not free speech. That is simply illegal, and that therefore censorship should not. My stance does not apply to that.
Yeah, but then, I mean, before we move on to Yash,
The
before
question was
we,
to my
So my question to you,
one
sir,
second, Ave,
is:
one second, Ave, one
are
second.
you saying that it's okay for that state?
Ave,
Yeah.
I request you to refrain from cross talking. Firstly,
Yes,
before
sir.
we continue, I just like to point out to you that in this debate, the topic stands is can censorship be justified? Right? We are not talking about censorship laws in itself. You could speak about the morality of censorship. You could mention examples of how censorship has affected certain things in the past or is affecting things in the present, and you could speak of its implications as well, not just the legal barriers on it. Okay, so
Sure.
with that,
Could I
It
comment
was a
on
question to me. Can I answer it, please?
yeah, Yash, that was, yeah, continue.
Okay.
from whom?
So
Ave,
Aryan and I were having a
Aryan,
certain
sorry.
debate
Yeah.
regarding social media censorship, right? He
I
said
see.
that if Instagram decides to remove something, that is in order to prevent liability on Instagram, right? That someone can say that why did Instagram let that particular piece of hate speech remain on their website? However, that is your perception of what their intention is, and the point of a debate is to move with logic and facts, and therefore prove your point. You are making an assumption here that Instagram decides to remove it because they don't want liability of what's posted on their website. However, Instagram could just be removing it as a means to enforce their own morality, right? For example, if Instagram thinks XYZ is wrong, and in their terms and conditions, they have expressly stated that they reserve the right to remove any content that they think is wrong, which they have, and most social media sites do, then as a body and legally they're allowed to remove that particular content from their website, irrespective of whether or not it's wrong, irrespective of whether or not they want liability or do not want liability, and irrespective of not whether you or the law thinks it's wrong. If they think it's wrong, they are legally allowed to remove it because they have already taken permission from you in when
Yes.
you click on the terms and conditions box.
Yes. Yes, so to my reply to that would again be in line with the original topic of this debate. If it is justified or not, I do not believe it is justified, simply because that is an impediment to free speech, unless the content in question is hate speech or an exception to free speech.
Right.
With the exception of those situations, I believe it is unjustified for Instagram to remove it,
So
which
exactly,
is
your
not the case.
Could
Which is not the case.
especially made by the law.
What?
Or what you state your beliefs are can go
Hmm.
against what the law states. The law states
Hmm.
that if you concede to Instagram, if you allow Instagram to remove your content if they think it's wrong, then the only thing that need be true for your content to be removed is Instagram thinking it's wrong. It need not even be an exception to free speech there.
That is where the unjustified part comes, sir. I do not believe Instagram in itself is justified to remove that content. It is wrong in removing that content.
I think
That is the topic.
his
So
point.
then don't agree to the terms and conditions.
Aryan, I think what like to simplify it. I think what Yash means to say is that when you make an Instagram account, you agree to the terms and conditions, right? So so what Yash is saying, it's if Instagram has reserved the right to remove something that they believe is wrong, the user that has agreed to these terms and conditions doesn't really have to have anything to say, because over here morality, he's saying morality doesn't particularly matter here, because they have legally reserved the right when they've made.
Yes, sir. I understand his point entirely. My argument is that if the content in question is an exception to free speech, it is illegal as defined in the constitution, then it should be removed on grounds that it is stupid. Next, if the content, if I post a selfie of myself with nothing moral, with nothing immoral in question or illegal in question, and Instagram removes that, that is up to Instagram's discretion, but I would call it unjustified because it has no basis for removing.
And like just to add, just in terms of knowledge, if let's say a user believes that Instagram removing a piece of content from their account is unjustified, they are allowed to make this claim and discuss it with Instagram. So these disputes are settled over mail communications.
So Ryanj, has your account ever been removed from Instagram? Or like
No, but I am aware of people. I know of people whose accounts have been removed.
sorry.
Uh,
Can we get
could
on
I ask a question to Aryan?
unformatted?
I don't. Could you, Ava, could you repeat what you were saying?
Can I ask Aryan a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so Aryan, you just said that if someone says something that is an exception to free speech, like as you gave the example of hate speech, then it should be removed. Don't you
Yes.
consider that censorship and thus forfeit your stance?
No, sir. My stance is that it is an impediment to free speech. If it is hate speech, it is not free speech. It is illegal speech, and therefore should be removed.
But that's censorship.
No,
So
no.
you're
That is
agreeing that censorship is okay.
that is censorship enforcing the law, sir. This is
Yes,
That
not
is
sir, but that's
arbitrary.
still censorship, right?
so
So
that's
you're
a
saying that it's
sentence.
justified.
You can't argue with interpretation of the motion.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way that's just a difference of opinion.
Okay,
there.
okay,
Right.
cool.
Okay.
Given that I established that it should be amended and not eradicated in the
Right.
first place, and
Aryan,
now
yeah,
amended
understood.
right after that.
Okay.
Where is the next speaker?
Where is the?
Next speaker.
I
Uh,
think Earth just left.
1 second. We will resume when Arth joins. All right. So after that, we have two more people joining us. We have Vanchvardhan Chomal and Rohan Lodge joining us as well. So we'll be continuing with with the next speaker, who is Abhay Tulsia. No, not Abhay. It was, I think, Arth speaking against the motion. Arth, you have a time of 3 minutes, and your time starts now.
So, firstly, I'm here to challenge the belief of the House, which is that this House believes that censorship as an idea is justified. Now, when we talk about the arguments of the proposition with regard to censorship, what we must understand is that the proposition has clearly not understood the meaning of the word, because we had a question from the proposition where they talked about child porn. Now, what we must understand is when we talk about censorship as an idea, what is illegal should not be considered, because what's illegal is already illegal in front of the law, and that cannot be permitted simply because it's a crime. And when we talk about censorship of a criminal offense, then that does not make sense, because when you try to grow a flower in an environment and the flower does not grow, you change the environment in which it grows and not the flower. When we talk about
the whole idea of preaching people what is true or letting people know what the reality is, censorship is just a war against what is real. When we try to hide stuff, when we try to hide what is actually existing in society, that does not change the fact that it does not exist anymore when you hide it. Because even when you hide it, it still exists. Now, the proposition has given certain arguments which take the idea of censorship to make an ideal Bangali Bhalo Chele or an ideal Sharmaji's son, which is not true, ladies and gentlemen. When we talk about the whole idea of censorship, it is definitely against the democratic ideals as raised by my co-speaker Aryan Singhania. Now I very well understand that we are Indians and disregarding democratic values has become a modern trend these days, but definitely we wouldn't like to go with it. When we talk about the whole idea of common public policy or the concept of morality, what we must understand is, let's take a case in point here. The Indecent Representation of Women's Act of 1986. Tell me something, ladies and gentlemen, since the proposition assumed that the government will use censorship as a proper tool or as a tool which is used in positive means is wrong in the first place. Because tell me something, if someone abusing on a public screen is something which is considered immoral, or let's say someone wearing a bikini is considered as immoral according to the Censorship Board of India, I don't know what the Censorship Board of India thinks. Because when we talk about a common public policy, what we must understand is it is something which should be in violation of the law. It is something which should be sexist in nature. It is something which should be racist in nature. Because hate cannot be accepted under any circumstances. Therefore, considering something which is legal or not hateful to be under the idea of censorship is wrong. But considering something which is hateful or which is a crime already is not, because it does not make sense that way. When we talk about the whole idea of censorship, what we must understand is people will stretch it unnecessarily. It is like a rubber band, ladies and gentlemen. They will stretch it and stretch it and they will stretch it to a point they won't even understand the whole.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Well, got it. Thank you, Arth. So I think we'll move on to the questions now. First question, Yash.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, you say that censorship is justified as long as it is against things that are, according to you, criminal offenses. However, when has the government censored something which is not, according to that government, a criminal offense? And when has the government as a body censored something which does not go against the word of the law, or whatever law, which does not go against the word of the law? Secondly, whatever the law exists to enforce correct morality, right? And therefore, when a government censors a woman in a bikini, it only censors the woman in the bikini for sections of society that should not be available to. For example, it makes the movie PG-13, or it enforces age restrictions on that movie or on that particular form of content. And therefore, that is an enforcement of a particular type of morality that the law and the government stands to uphold. And therefore, even that form of censorship is, in your words, to serve a positive means.
Sir, a very simple counter question to this. When Hitler banned all the political parties in his own country, where did he try to uphold the goodness you're talking about? Where did he try to uphold the legality you're talking about? Where did he try to uphold proper governance you're talking about? When you give the control of censorship to a government, the word control being the keyword here, they try to control you instead of governing you. There's a difference between the word governing and there's a difference between the word controlling. The government is there to govern you, not to control you. And when certain censorship problems, like what we have seen in the past, Hitler banned all the political parties. Many political leaders do not let the opposition exist properly because of the censorship laws. For example, which we have learned in many countries, which we have learned in many cases. How does the government try to hold the legal ethos or the democratic ethos by doing that action or taking that action?
Question.
Right. Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Well, the basis of your question is based on a very radical example. For example, when you talk about the usefulness of a pencil for education, you can't take the example that John Wick used it to kill people, right? You must take into account valid examples that are present today and that reflect a moral and legally correct government. However, Hitler propagated genocide and therefore not a valid example for any debate of this form. And
Sir,
furthermore, but my point would be to all justifiable, justifiable and all properly valid examples that you could take for this scenario. Thank you.
sir, have you heard of this very genius gentleman called John Logibard? He was labeled as a heretic. Do you know why he was labeled as a heretic? Because he invented the television. And who labeled him as a heretic? The people, the government. Were they correct? No.
And
Simple argument.
Arth, before we move on to the next question, just to clarify, just to fact
Yeah,
check
yeah.
something you said, when Hitler did remove his opposition parties, he didn't do it illegally. He did it under legal means. He passed decrees. He after the president at the time, I think it was I don't recall his name, but anyway, after he passed Hindenburg, he merged the executive and the legislative, and then passed his decrees through his council that was elected by the people. Because each speaker here, just to clarify, because each speaker here is continuously mentioning the legal system and its relation to censorship and
Sir, just counter argument to that fact check.
right.
Sir, what was the process which happened before Hitler banned the political parties? He introduced censorship in books. He
Sir,
introduced censorship in newspapers.
Sir,
He introduced censorship in newspapers. He
through the Reichstag fire decree. That is first. Secondly, he didn't remove every opposition party. He removed one key party, which was the KPD. The KPD was the most commonly known opposition party to the Nazi party, which is why Hitler removed it.
One question.
how does that come under the purview of the argument, sir?
I was fact checking what you said, sir. Yes, Mr. Chomal.
How is it fact
So
checking?
this
Yes,
will
yeah,
be
yeah.
appreciated if the
Just
moderator
about
didn't
right, this
intervene
has
apart
not
from
been debated, I
facilitating
guess.
debate.
Exactly. Sorry. I can't hear Chomal.
I'm saying that the fact checks can be done later on. I don't think this should be
Exactly.
right now.
Yes.
The floor is open to questions, right? I have a question.
Right.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
May I?
Mr. Agarwal, I think it is up to me to decide if he can go on. Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
that's what I'm
he's
asking.
addressing the question to me. Okay, anyway, fuck it. Go ahead.
Mr. Moderator, may I ask a question,
Yeah.
please?
Go on.
Yeah, thank you. So, sir, what I essentially believe is you're cherry picking examples for their own benefit. You are taking censorship as a very radical and extremist term, and you're only cherry picking examples which suit your argument in the first place. Secondly, sir, I totally agree with your point where you say that what is illegal should not come under the ambit of censorship because it is justified because it is illegal. Perfectly acknowledged. Good point, sir. But my question over here is that let's take the example of the coronavirus outbreak right now, the COVID-19 outbreak, which is at a global scale. Everybody has a phone in their hands. Everybody has access to internet. Everybody can shitpost anything and everything they want to. And this posting will only cause one thing, which is panic in the world. And panic is not suitable in this situation. So do you think the government should be the only body who should be releasing proper actual facts to the people so that they can, know how to deal with it instead of people just WhatsApping each other cures for the virus and saying that if you put haldi under your foot, you'll not catch the virus. So these things create panic. These things create confusion. So do you think even in such a situation, false information like this does not need to be censored by a central regulatory body so that the people can actually benefit? And do you think censorship should not prevail in this area so that the people can do whatever they want whenever they want? Because as you know, Indian people are very malleable. If I'd have
Yeah. WhatsApp forwards, taking the nation backwards.
Yes, sir, whatever. So that's just one example, but all of us know that how information catches on to people like fire. They believe everything and anything. I don't need to tell you that, sir. So that do you still think censorship is an ambiguous idea pertaining to this very situation or a situation which pertains to security and health and defense and all of that? So that is my question essentially.
So basically now when we talk about the existence of censorship, the prime example which was given to you, the COVID-19 example, what we must understand is what actually happens is there are a lot of interest groups, special groups and whatnot existing in a country's governance, right? Now when we talk about the existence of such groups in a country's governance, what can the government do is, and that is what the government has been doing in many countries, they are providing the correct information to these special groups, interest groups, and gradually the correct information moves to the media, gradually the correct information moves to the WhatsApp, and therefore these information is gradually corrected. And when we, for example, recently there was a fake news scandal in India with regard to a WhatsApp image where Indira Gandhi was there and Sitaram Yechuri was there. What happened was a fact check was published on WhatsApp by the Times of India, and it was circulated everywhere that this fact, which was already said to you or which has already reached to you, is wrong in nature. But what we must understand is censorship might act as another weapon as well. For example, today you said that it helps the people not to be panicked or not to get attacked by the panic which they are receiving. But on the other hand, the government might use that as a tool to not let the people know the sides of both the coins. For example, the government might tell them what is beneficial for them and not what is bad for them, which is
Understood, sir. So, question.
Wait, before Chomal asks his question,
One
can I
second, sir. Moderator, sir. Moderator, sir.
also, sir, a simple counter question, a very simple counter question.
Arth, you had
Yeah.
you said what you had to say.
Yeah, okay, fine.
Chomal, yes, you may respond to him.
Thank you, sir. Sir, again, you debating on this agenda, on this motion, your job is to convince me that the whole idea is flawed. It is not to say that it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. Let's take the example for democracy. There are counter arguments that democracy is a bad thing. There will be many people who will say that democracy is not justified, not valid. But again, you will say that it has its good, it has its bad. Your job over here is tell me it has no good at all. But sir, you yourself are accepting that yes, it can be used to curtail the panic, it can be used to do all of that, but it can also be negatively used. Everything in
No,
this world,
sir.
as
Sir,
negative.
firstly, if your idea of debating tells you that the debater does not acknowledge if there are pros or if there are cons, then that is not the idea of debating. The debater acknowledges both the cons and both the pros, and I am just saying that the cons here outweigh the pros, not
So
that
you're
the cons do
saying,
not exist.
so you're saying in a country like India, I'm talking about my question. You're saying that over here, your idea is that censorship, the pros outweigh the cons, right? In this situation,
Yeah, I feel
in this
I feel
particular.
that I feel that the arguments
Let him
against
finish.
censorship outweigh the arguments for censorship.
Let him finish. Let him finish.
Yeah, okay.
Oh no, okay, I got my answer. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
I'll
Yeah,
just.
okay.
all right. Yeah,
can I
Avan.
speak now?
Yes,
Yeah.
just right after Avan.
So, sir, in your speech and in your answers to the questions, you repeatedly said that some examples.
Abhay. Just a second. Sorry, just a second. Continue now.
Uh,
Yeah. So you kept saying that some forms of censorship were excessive. For example, what Hitler did. And fine, the proposition is not saying that what Hitler did in the form of censorship was okay. But the motion here clearly states that censorship can be justified. You are saying that censorship has pros, censorship has cons. The cons outweigh the pros. But, sir, the point is that if you agree that censorship in any form or in any way is okay or is acceptable, then you drop your stance right there. So could you please explain how, if even a single form of censorship is okay, your motion, the motion still drop or the motion still
Sorry,
fails?
I
The
did not
motion
say that. Yeah. Go ahead.
so are you saying that censorship is in no situation applicable, in no way correct, in no way in any situation justified?
So just
Because you kept saying, because if you say that in, yeah.
yeah, just summarizing what Chomal and Avya have been saying, but Arch has probably not been interpreting correctly. The motion states censorship can be justified.
yeah.
He's an opposition speaker.
I
Therefore,
couldn't hear Avay. What did he say?
by logical default, I'm summarizing what he said. Okay. So what
Okay,
Chomal and
thank you.
Avya essentially said is that the motion reads censorship can be justified. Art is an opposition speaker. Hence, his stance is the logical opposite of the motion, which is censorship cannot be
He
justified.
said that.
If he concedes that censorship can be justified in the COVID-19 outbreak situation or in any other situation.
I did not say that. Did I say that it's justified? I said that this is.
Not posing a new
This is.
question.
I said that this is.
Earth, let him finish.
Okay, cool.
Kindly.
No, but he's misquoting me. I said that the
Kindly don't
COVID-19
do that.
situation is a
Summarizing the question,
disadvantage.
Earth,
He is summarizing the questions,
Okay,
or not you.
uh,
He is
Earth
summarizing the
is
question.
Earth is
not
Earth
yours.
is Earth.
If the opposition
Let him finish.
speaker concedes that censorship in any situation is justifiable, then he is by default dropping the exact wording of his logical stance. Censorship cannot be justified, because if censorship cannot be justified, then how is it justified in this case? Thank you.
All right.
Yeah. So can I speak? Can I speak?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I never said that censorship is justified in this case. I said that this is a disadvantage of the whole outcome and the whole system. I never said that this makes censorship as an idea justifiable to the public.
Right. Thank you.
Am I clear to you?
Yes, I think.
That exactly was my question, right? So
I think
whether
you're.
in this situation, is it justifiable or not justifiable? That was the question.
Right.
So if you didn't answer that, I don't know what you answered.
I think he. Would you like to respond to that, Arth, or are you done?
Respond to what?
Respond to. Do you have anything else to say to Yash, or do we move on?
May I speak?
Yeah, we're moving on to Lodge next. Yeah, Lodge, go on.
Right. So, from what I've understood about this debate, there is no parameter here at all. And now, one side, firstly, I need a clarification over here, because I am being told that when you talk about censorship, you're not talking about something like, say, child porn or unsolicited pornography, on the grounds that such pornography is a crime and therefore is inherently illegal. Right. However, we also go on to say that the censorship that took place in the Nazi regime was bad censorship, because you cannot trust the law. I do not understand the parameters being defined here. On one end, I am being told that if something is a crime, censoring it is fine. But when the Nazi regime does so in its own manner, it is no longer fair. And here is the problem with this, right? I understand the morality difference between censoring child porn and censoring information that would help free Jewish people. But the fundamental question here is the same. The nuances and policy of every country, every individual is separate. What I believe as something that is a crime that should be censored is drastically different from anything that, say, the Nazi regime would believe, or anything that the Indian government believes. On what grounds are we defining crime in relation to censorship? Because if you are just making law or to justify censorship, then you're not justifying. Then you're justifying all forms of censorship or no forms of censorship.
Can the answer to be that given?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So a very simple argument or counter argument to that thing, the question asked. When you talk about a crime being censored, that crime cannot be displayed. Why? Because it is already illegal in the country. And moreover, when you quote me on giving the Nazi example, just know that I said that Hitler used the censorship idea or the ideal of censorship by building control, and he did what was wrong. And when I when I said that Hitler used the idea of censorship, okay, agreed, that is bad censorship. But what I said is, if there is a case of bad censorship, how do we trust the government to have a good censorship in the first place? Because we are the ones giving control to the government in the first place. It's an example where the control can be misused. And in every case, the control can be misused if it has been misused in one case. That is my entire argument, because you give control to the government. You give away your autonomy to the government.
Yes,
the government is there for governing you. The government is not there for controlling you.
Arth, you made your point.
Okay.
Arth, yes, you
Now,
made your point.
understanding why the government has so much power in the first
Moderator sir.
Yes.
Just a very simple question. If others are not allowed to speak after a question being asked, or after an answer being answered, from where does this point come from? How does the speaker speak? On what basis does the speaker speak?
Could you?
I apologize on his behalf. Rohan, please don't. Sorry.
So to that point.
All right. We'll be taking the last question. Yash, the last question for this speaker, Yash.
Okay. So inherently, the opposition Record Beach Act has several times conceded that censorship is all right, and it's not censorship according to them at all when something is against the law and then it's being censored. However, what we must realize is whenever, and as I've said before too, and as Rohan Lodge himself stated right now, whenever a government censors something, it has to be against the law, right? Either they make it against the law by passing a bill, or it is already against the law as the government sees it, or the law that the government is meant to follow, right? So whenever something is being censored, it is as a blanket rule against the law of the land. Hence, what is censorship? Which part can be justified? Which part can't? What is good censorship? What is bad censorship? The opposition, Aryan, Arth, both included, record be checked. That censorship
Can
is
I
not censorship.
answer?
Let
Sir,
him
is
finish.
the
Let him
speaker,
finish.
sir, is the speaker insinuating that the government cannot break the law?
No. Wait. Can I
Arth,
answer? Wait.
Arth,
Can I be done?
relax.
The question is to me.
Arth, let Yash finish. Then can you answer?
Oh, he hasn't finished yet. I thought that was a question. Okay.
Yes, same.
Anyway, go ahead.
So exactly. So whenever a government censors something, it is already against the law of the land. And since record be checked, exactly this, I'm not interpreting it. I'm stating what has been stated. That censorship, when it is breaking the law, is either not censorship or is good censorship. So hence, when all censorship is by the government is censorship of things that are breaking the law, then what is good censorship and what is bad censorship?
Can I answer now?
Go ahead. Yes.
Sir, if censorship is something which is already against the law, how the hell is Sunny Leone in a bikini against the law? Please explain this.
Was that a rhetorical question, or are you actually
I have
asking?
a very important
Answer to
question.
that, a simple answer to that. He said that censorship can be implemented when something is against the law. How is Sunny Leone dancing in a bikini against the law?
Can
That's
I
it.
answer that question?
Yes, so go ahead, please. I'm not interested in
There is a huge difference between what the law is and what a guideline is. Sunny Leone wearing a bikini is not against the law, it is against certain
Because
guidelines.
Yash mentioned the word law. Because Yash mentioned the word law. I thought this was the last question.
Arth, I request you let the speaker finish before you interrupt.
On what basis is he speaking? On what basis is he speaking? Moderator, why the fuck are you being unfair?
Arth, firstly,
Because you said you want someone to answer your
Arth,
question, so I'm answering your question.
Arth,
What process of debating do you guys follow?
Arth, firstly,
Have you not ever debated? The fuck are you guys?
Arth, if there is
Yeah, go ahead.
Arth, if there is such a big problem, we can clarify this later. How, firstly, there is no reason for vulgarity in your language. That is first. Second, let me
Right?
finish.
What's your tone?
Yeah, that's first. Secondly, Arth, relax.
You're muted, bro.
Arth, you're muted. Can you relax for a moment? What? This is not as mentioned to every speaker here. This is not classified as a formal debate. This is being done in along the guidelines of a debate, but in no way is it going to be classified as a debate. That is first. Second, this guideline is only followed to help facilitate discussion in a better way. It is a guideline. It is not a rule book that we are following. Okay, now with that being said, Lodge, please continue your point.
I have a question.
Yeah. My entire I was simply answering a question that the speaker posed under the influence again that this was an informal debate. Now, the question that he asked was on what grounds is Sunny Leone, on what grounds is it a crime to show Sunny Leone wearing a bikini or something along those lines? And quite simply, it's not. Sunny Leone wearing a bikini is protected by guidelines because quite simply, the logic behind it is that the government of India believes that such information should not be presented to people of a certain age, and given they cannot control the presentation of that information, they are controlling the access to that information, and that is the grounds on which most censorship law exists. So therefore, you have to understand censorship law is not black and white. It's not just ban or no ban. The perfect example of this is the film censor board. There are multiple facets to censorship. You have to, if you are having a debate on this, at least define the parameters or on what burden is the opposition taking or what burden is side government trying to prove.
All right. Does any Pranit, you had a question? Yeah.
No, I was asking when my speech would begin, since it
Yeah.
will not step up since
Yes.
the
Yeah,
speech.
yeah. Your speech will begin now. See, yeah. No more questions on this speech after this event.
Sir,
Yes, sir.
sir, since the other member of the opposition was allowed to answer to the rhetorical question I had thrown, sir, will the moderator allow another statement on that, because there
Arth,
is something which is condescending, and
Arth,
since the last speaker was allowed.
Arth, if you would like me to send you a clipping of the recording, I will send it to you. But you said, and I quote, "I want him to answer this," and he did. He lodged.
I wanted Yash to, but okay.
No, but Yash gave permission to Lodge to answer, which is why
I
Lodge answered.
recognize, yeah,
Okay, that
I
is fine.
recognize it as
Okay,
rhetorical
okay,
language.
fine,
But
fine,
if
fine,
you
fine.
wanted to answer, let him answer.
You said, and I
No,
quote, "I want him to answer this."
sir, I promise you it will be one line. One line.
Uh,
One line.
one line and no more is what we will take. Go.
Rohan, do you think the guideline which allowed the Indian government to censor Sunny Leone wearing a bikini, is that guideline fair? Is a fair guideline or not? Is
Okay,
that a fair guideline or not?
that's it. Rohan, yes or no? Is it or is it not?
Yes.
There you go. Happy, you asked him, is it or is it not?
Okay. Yeah. Good.
Fine. Now, after this eventful speech, we will move on to our next speaker, Pranit. You have 3 minutes, and your time starts now. Pranit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the main point raised by the opposition during the speech has been that their stance is that censorship is justified when it is against things which are already considered illegal. They are not they are condemning censorship against free speech, not illegal speech. However, I can pinpoint two flaws with this. Firstly, it admits that legal bodies like the government has the right to define what is considered legal and not. It gives legal bodies the right to classify certain sections of speech as hate speech or harmful to society, and certain sections of speech as acceptable. The second flaw with this is that it does not recognize the very fact that classifying certain sections of speech as hate speech or illegal speech is an act of censorship in itself. Thus the opposition fails to actually fulfill the position that they're required to take in this debate, which is that censorship can be justified, right? They have been trying to explain the fact that censorship isn't justified when it's against already illegal things. Now, to bring up some constructive arguments, I'm going to point out areas where censorship has been beneficial to society. Now, the spread of false information, such as regarding the COVID-19 virus, has been brought up by the arguments. I can bring up a similar historical example when cigarette or alcohol companies would advertise their cigarettes without providing the correct information as to how those products were harmful to consumers, or how they and thus the government in this case had the right to place the form of censorship on those companies in on their packaging and in other forms, in explaining to consumers the types of harms that they possessed. Secondly, the kind of moral censorship which has been discussed recently, such as whether Sunny Leone in a bikini can be considered moral or not. As Rohan Lott said, it is moral because there's a certain body, and as the opposition itself has accepted, these bodies have the right to explain what is and what is not just. We on the proposition believe that censorship can be justified, which is the main line of this debate, because of the various ways in which it is implemented, which benefits society. Art's main argument rests on the assumption that when we give governments the control to implement censorship, they will misuse it. His entire case lies on that argument and completely ignores the fact that the government has largely not misused it. The government has certain groups to keep their actions in check. Earth has ignored the fact that Sunny Leone in a bikini isn't actually illegal. Owing if you've ever watched a movie or passed by a movie poster for say Masti Zade or anything.
Pranit, wrap up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's it.
basically, what I'm trying to say is that the opposition today has not fulfilled their requirement, which is in proving that censorship cannot be justified.
All right. 1 second.
Question
Yeah.
to Pranit.
Thank you, Pranit. Now we'll be moving on to the questions and answers. Who has the first question? Seeing as Aryan raised his hand first, Aryan, your question.
Right. So in the former part of your speech, you mentioned that given the opposition's point to resting upon the government misusing their power of legislation, you said that it is open to interpretation what the government defines as free speech or not. So keeping in mind the fact that no law can be formed without expressly defining what the violation the violation question is. For example, hate speech is defined in the ICCPR. It is defined in the International Covenant to eliminate discrimination based on race, etc. So given that it is defined in multiple statutes in the world in international law and domestic law, and that applies to every single violation or exception to free speech, so on what basis do you say that a government's implementation of a law is based on interpretation of it?
Right.
Okay, well, firstly to clarify,
Continue.
Firstly, to clarify, I did not say that. I didn't say that a government's implementation of a law is open to interpretation of it. I've said that that is what the opposition has accepted by ceding to the fact that the government has the right to censor certain types of speech, because the very act of declaring a certain form of speech, that's a hate speech, illegal, is a form of censorship. Now, moving on to a more substantive rebuttal of that argument, I can provide a legal definition of obscenity as has been provided by a certain US court ruling, which I do not remember. It is obscenity can be defined as any content which presents sexual conduct in a manner appealing to a consumer's prurient nature in a way that does not provide significant educational, scientific, artistic, or literary value. This is a perfectly justifiable legal definition and basis for declaring certain types of content legal or not. And so I do not see why the opposition has a problem with the government having such legal definitions for censorship.
Right.
So
So question.
Follow up, so.
He's following up.
Question.
Yeah, go on, Aryan.
Right, so the same ruling that you mentioned, that exact same ruling includes the words depravity and corruptive, both of those words not defined in the US legislation, therefore making it open to interpretation and hence leaving scope for misusing the law.
Right.
Right.
Misinterpreting the law, my bad, sir, sorry.
Right. So considering that the kind of people, considering that the examples of implementation of censorship laws, which have actually historically taken place, considering that these implementations are carried out by judges and legal scholars, with considerable experience and prudence in being able to define what should and should not be obscene, do you not think that it is better to have a kind of guideline which uses words, rather fairly clear words such as you said, depraving and corrupting, rather than no guideline at all, which allows for the possibility for harmful content, such as, say, extreme violence, being available to the consumption of, say, extremely young children? And basically, is it not better to have something which is
right
imperfect and not perfectly legally rigorous?
Understood.
Which acts as the
Thank you, Pranit. Thank you, Aryan.
Question.
Yes, sir. Continue.
So 3 counter arguments, sir. So the example of cigarette packets, where you talked about the warning not being present on the cigarette packet. So don't you think that you are confused between the concepts of awareness and censorship when you quote this example? And Sir, another counter argument. So don't you think the word obscenity is subjective nature? Because what might be obscene to me is not obscene to you, right? And when we talk about the whole government using censorship, so yes or no question, do you think that the government of India is doing a perfect job when it comes to censorship?
All right. Pranith, your response?
Okay, right. So replying to the first question, which is whether or not I'm confusing awareness for censorship, the very act of forcing a company to place a warning on its products, which covers up 70% of the packaging, it is very much an act of censorship, which also doubles as serving to provide awareness. Your second question asked a word like obscenity and whether or not it is subjective. Now, I do not see how whether or not the word obscenity being subjective links to the actual motion. Okay, wait. Oh, let me rephrase this. Whether or not obscenity is perfectly legally rigorous does not actually provide any evidence that censorship cannot be justified, because I have provided examples and uses of censorship being justified, being beneficial, and whether or not a hypothetical use of a government using the flexible nature of the word obscenity to censor something which could possibly be not so obscene at all isn't actually
Right.
valid, because it is still
Right.
hypothetical. You cannot provide any historical example of
Sir,
that,
I
I
have a
believe.
question. In,
Sir,
so I have a
I
question
believe
in
Earth
regard to
had
his
a
response.
I believe Earth had a third
Oh,
question.
yeah, my bad.
Uh,
Uh,
Earth, could you repeat your third question?
Yeah, sir. Since
Yes
you
or no
said
question. Go ahead.
that since you said that I presented my argument by ignoring the fact or by believing the fact that the government can only misuse censorship, right? So, sir, a very simple question. Do you think that the government of India is doing a perfect job when it comes to censorship? And if you say that my argument was solely based on how a certain a certain member or a certain instance in history where censorship was used in a negative way, does that change the fact that censorship can be used in a negative way? Does that change the fact that you're giving away your control to the government of India or to the government of any country? That is my question, sir.
right.
I
So
can
I
he
have a
said,
question to the moderator, like just
uh,
going on.
yeah.
Is this debate set in India, or is this a debate
Uh,
on principles in a House of
so the debate, the topic is, can censorship be justified, right? Censorship, we're not talking about, we're not keeping it very direct to laws, and if there are laws in which country or another. It's the general concept of censorship is what we're discussing here, and uh, the debaters are speaking for and against it. Yeah. Pranit, yeah, yes or no?
Yeah, so though it was a yes or no question, I'll be going in a bit more detail. It doesn't really affect the relevance of my argument whether or not a certain country is implementing censorship perfectly, even when you have not, besides the Sunny Leone example, which I already reacted to. Besides that example, you have not really provided any reason for me to believe that India isn't um, perfectly implementing censorship. Second of all, your argument which asks that you ask that the fact that you mentioned a particular instance in history of a leader using censorship for negative ways, you ask that does that not imply that censorship cannot be দাঁড়াও মা debate করছি. Does that not imply that censorship can be used does it not imply that censorship can be used in negative ways? Well, obviously
No, no,
it
no.
can. Any sort of action which affects a large portion of information being presented or affects such a large portion of society can obviously be used for misuse. However, does this what you're failing to understand is that you're not actually supposed to be debating whether this can be used for misuse. You're supposed to be debating whether it can ever be justified, and therefore your opposition was actually supposed to be take a very hardline philosophical stance on the very act of censorship itself. It was supposed to mention how censorship can't be justified, how it's wrong, how all information should be presented freely, but you failed to do that. You continue to provide some sort of normative link between censorship and its misuse, which I agree exists. There exists a link between censorship and its possibility for misuse, but it's not relevant
Right,
to the debate.
right.
Thank you,
Yash,
sir.
Yash,
This has been going on for an hour and 40 minutes. Can I I have 1 minute left to speak, right? My last 1 minute from my
Yeah.
speech is scheduled
Yeah.
at the end. Yeah,
Would
so
would you like to do it now?
it's been 1 hour 40 minutes. When is this ending? I'd just like to know.
I am. I can't give you an estimate. No, I don't think I
No,
can.
but like
We have
Yash has a minute. Yash has a minute. Avva has a minute. Then the debate's over. I'm assuming.
I mean, if
Yash
there's,
has a minute and Aryan has a minute.
I mean,
Does
seeing
Aryan
as,
even
Oh, sorry. Aryan has a minute. Sorry.
yeah,
But the
yeah,
point of there being a first speaker who gets an extra minute is that there's no speakers before that, so there's no room for
No.
discussion. But
Yeah,
You
Aryan had
conclude.
we'll be ending
And
with,
moderator,
yeah.
sir, the 1 minute for Yash and Aryan, those aren't subject to questioning because they've already responded to questions.
Yeah. It's
That
see.
that
Yeah.
Generally, what happens is moderator. So, can I have a question
It's
to
purely
you
a sum up.
um
about the rules? Yeah. Exactly. Summing up. Exactly.
yeah. Ask me. Yes. What's your question?
Also, sir, I will be leaving in
So
10 minutes because I have priorities, commitments to get to solve. Yeah.
the 1 minute which is going to be given, sir, moderator, sir, can you hear me?
Yes.
The 1 minute which is going to be given to the speakers, the first speakers of the opposition and the first speaker of the proposition. So, will that 1 minute be used for summing up, or can that 1 minute be used on independent discretion of themselves? Like
Uh,
any way they want to use it.
Let me explain what this 1 minute procedure will be. That's what you want to know, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, okay. Like we had at the start, they had 2 minutes question. At the end of it, seeing as both these two speakers have certain prior commitments and can't further delay, we'll keep maybe 2 questions at max, and wrap it up there, unless for the purpose of discussion any speaker has something further to add. Is that clear?
So,
Yes.
so this extra 1 minute is supposed to be so that they're allowed to respond to the arguments made by the other sides, not for summing up or for answering a
Right, but then
speaker.
you must understand,
essentially-
Yash, 1 second. Seeing as there were later there were another set of speeches after those first two, right? And they didn't get a chance to uh, respond. So that 1 minute is dedicated, ideally dedicated to that response firstly, and because the later speakers were allowed to be questioned on the basis of their responses as well, like Art was questioned on some of his responses, his counter arguments. Similarly, these people will also be asked to
Okay,
answer, be answered,
understood.
right?
Guys, counter argument.
uh,
Since okay,
right. Yeah.
Oh, I guess he was there to watch. I guess he was there to watch.
Relax, Yash,
counter
go on.
proposal. Since
Yeah.
if you continue with this format of response to response to response, like since it's been going on for 2 hours, I don't think there's any stopping to it. And a lot of us have places to be after. So instead of that, could we change the format such that I give a 1 minute concluding statement?
Sir, I
covering-
think I'll just
Yeah.
see Suryansh. This isn't going to end by 8, and I have to go at 8. So I think I'm going to leave then right now. Then I mean, sooner than ever.
So let them just sum up. Let them just sum up.
Fine.
Aryan gives
Yeah.
1 minute sum
I
up and that's it.
Is it okay with the rest of you if they just sum it up?
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
mind.
it's fine.
Yeah,
Absolutely
fine.
fine.
Okay, Aryan, you have a minute, and your time starts now.
Okay, so I believe that there have been certain questions raised with regard to the legality of legality of free speech. My point being since the beginning was that censorship in itself should not be eradicated because it is fundamental to how democracy works. However, censorship in most places is not justified, including the unnecessary guidelines imposed on it, as mentioned by Rohan Lodge. Next, any act that is illegal as defined under the constitution does not fall under free speech because it is an exception to free speech, and therefore
Exactly.
a censorship that applies to it does not fall under my stance because I am not talking about it. I am talking about normal free speech, which is not bound by those exceptions. That out of the way. Next, when I talk about legal precedent, in the US common law system, as pointed out by Praneeth, there was a US judgment which gave a definition with regard to obscenity. Obscenity is an open-ended thing with two elements under it which are not defined under law. And since common law sets precedent in a common law
Exactly.
system, the judge's judgment will be binding precedent over other rulings. Therefore, there is an open-ending definition of obscenity in the United States, which leads to interpretation and bad
Okay.
law.
Yeah. Thank you, Aryan. Would you be open to maybe one question
Yeah,
if
sure.
there is? Yeah. And does anyone have any? He's open to it before he leaves. So, is there anyone with a
Yeah.
question? Yeah, Ave. Yeah. You can't be heard. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, you're mute, bro. You
Unmute
can't
yourself.
be.
Yeah, go on.
Sir, you said right now in your sum up speech that censorship in almost all forms currently is unjustified. But, sir, are you conceding that censorship in some forms as it exists today or some forms as you would like to see it existing would be justified?
Yes, sir. By unjustified censorship, by justified censorship, I mean not showing nudity in a cartoon. For example, Peppa Pig having nudity would count as where censorship is needed, but it's not there. However, in an R-rated movie, when you have censorship, then that again on a
Shit.
case-to-case basis, in most cases, would probably not count
बोल
as
दे तुम्हारे फोने चार्ज कम ওরাও
justified
নিয়ে তোমার
justified
ঠিক চার্জ দাও
censorship.
Moderator,
লাস্ট 4 মিনিট বাকি শুধু একটা সামিং আপ কোথায়
Yeah.
so, sir, so through saying that censorship in movies, as you said, or censorship of nudity being justified, aren't you agreeing that some forms of censorship are justified, therefore forfeiting your stance? Because
So
the motion says
since
censorship
the
can be
begin
justified.
Guys, I
my
have one
stance
minute.
my stance since the beginning, I will say it again, means that censorship should not be eradicated. It should be amended in order to remove unjustified usage of it. Justified usage, unjustified usage depends on the case-to-case basis, which I illustrated with the Peppa Pig example that I gave, and any example similar there too.
Right.
Can
Thank
I
you.
finish?
Okay, sir.
Yash, you have a question.
No, I have a minute.
Right. Yash, your time starts now.
Okay, essentially, the motion states censorship can be justified. The opposition was meant to represent the point censorship cannot be justified, which, in my opinion, the opinion of the House, and probably everyone watching this, they have not been able to do for the simple reason that their intent should have been to look at it at a philosophical level and explain why censorship as a concept is wrong, which they were attempting to do at the beginning, where Aryan Singhania brought up the Plato point and questioned me based on how censorship hides truth and that as a concept. However, both those points were clearly opposed by the proposition, wherein we pointed out the difference between democracy and Greek democracy, which is full autonomy, and therefore how Plato did not oppose the current concept of democracy that is in practice, and therefore the opposition has failed to finish what they started. And secondly, they continuously have claimed that when censorship violates a law, then it is indeed justified or is indeed good censorship. However, the fact that first of all they are conceding something is good censorship goes against what we perceive should have been their intent, and secondly, the fact that they concede that anything that's against the law is good censorship once again goes against the fact that most modern day governments, not talking about dictatorships or Hitler's time, have always passed a bill and act or certain guidelines that fall under the word of the law, a statute of legal organizations which are indirectly a part of the law.
Right.
And however, up to interpretation are by court rulings the law, and only then
Yeah,
censored
that's it.
content
Yeah.
has essentially been a part of that, and therefore I believe the proposition is correctly met their end, and the
Right.
opposition has not been able to finish what they
Right.
started.
Right. Thank you. Would you be open to a question if there is one?
Sure.
Does anyone have a question towards Yash? Any counter argument or something to what he said? Yes, sir.
I'm going to leave.
Yes, thank you for joining, Aryan.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Arth, last question for the day.
Yeah. Sir, don't you think that giving away a control or giving away your autonomy to the government is against the very democratic idea, is against the very democratic ideals, or is something which is scary in nature because there is a possibility that it can be misused, and we as citizens cannot ignore that possibility that censorship cannot be misused. And if you say so that we can ignore it, so like on what basis do you say that as citizens we can or we should have the confidence to ignore the possibility of censorship as an idea being misused?
So essentially, the motion states censorship can be justified, and myself as a proposition speaker believe that if an entire country or an entire governance essentially gives away the power to a particular body to govern them, they are beyond a particular degree of reasoning justifiable and can justify legally what they're doing, and therefore I'm not talking about what is subjective and what you think should be censored and what you think should not be censored. To a certain degree of morality and legality, that particular body, uh, if an entire population of over a billion people in India, especially, has voted for a particular government to come into power, then that government can objectively justify a large degree of what they are doing, and therefore censorship in these cases can be justified. Resting my case.
Right.
Follow up, if
So,
moderator and the speaker allows.
I allow it. Yash, would you be open to a follow-up?
I really have to leave. So could you make it short?
Sir, just two lines.
Yeah, 2 lines. No more, please.
Sir, you said that if people have voted a government to power, then they are expected to do and they are expected to explain their actions to the people and whatnot. So you are saying that a democratic system of government, there is no possibility that there will be a bad government in a democratic idea. Is that your argument or is that your statement when you say that? Because you just said that if people elect a government to power, then the government is not expected to act in a wrong way. So how do you expect the citizens to build that confidence in the first place? How do you expect the citizens to have that trust to their government? Because there have been ample amount of instances where the government hasn't acted up to the people's expectations.
One or two line question. What is the moderator doing here?
Yeah.
Sorry, apologies. The question's over.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Yash.
I'm not saying the government can never be wrong. I'm saying for the most part, the government can justify their actions and have justified their actions. If the justification does not seem correct to you, then that is your subjective political orientation, and that is something you believe. That is not against the word of the law that the government themselves publishes.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you.
I'm very, very anti-BJP.
All right.
Who is
On that fruitful note, thank you guys for joining. I hope you guys enjoyed. The results I'll be declaring very soon. And yeah, we'll be having we'll be having more such discussions every week on different topics. I hope you guys can join us for more. Thank you, and good night.
Good night.
Well, that's what happens when the floor is yours, ladies and gentlemen. Well, that was quite the eventful debate that we had for our first topic, can censorship be justified? And as promised, the awards, which were surprising, or the first, second and third best speakers, which was quite close, which could differ. However, I believe that in third place by a close margin to fourth was Pranit Sinha, who spoke really well. However, he just wasn't very active during the question answer sessions and etc., which really lost him out when it came to second and first. In second place, we had a tie actually, but with the two opposition speakers, both Aryan Singhania and Arth Agarwal, who spoke well, and I think they also participated quite a bit. However, I think that the only thing that kept them away from first place was that this person handled the question answer sessions impeccably. His rebuttals, his counter arguments, all on point. There was barely any flaw, if any, in his arguments and questions. So yeah, it was none other than Yash Pansari. Congratulations to all of them. I hope they can join us again for our next few sessions. And if you would like to be a part of this, you can click the link down in the description and sign up. You can get more details on the event by DMing us on our Instagram page. It will be down again in the description below. Be sure to follow us, like the video if you liked it, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. And yeah, well, that was the first episode of The Floor Is Yours. See y'all next time, and yeah, that's what that was.